but not much has been done about changing this as a measure of growth, of human progress. So I began investigating this matter a little bit more, and I discovered that other people had been thinking about it, people like Amartya Sen and so on, and they had come up with other indices such as the Human Development Index and so on. Unfortunately, none of them quite did the job. So I investigated a little bit more, and then we found that maybe we can reconstruct GDP in a completely different way, which took into account things like environmental damage, but also positive things like additions to the stock of human capital, for example. Now, a lot of methodologies around this has been worked out through the 80s and 90s by different economists around the world. But unfortunately, nobody had taken all this and actually tried to recalculate the GDP of any country. So I decided, quite unreasonably, that I was going to do this. Now remember, I had a full-time job. So this was something that I was going to do on weekends. And this is something that, mind you, governments around the world had not even attempted to do. So I roped in another friend of mine, a colleague of mine from Deutsche Bank called Pawan Sukhdev, and we basically spent the next several years, this is early part of the last decade, 2002, 2003, we spent the next few years spending our weekends, and my wife knows about this. We spend our weekends essentially going through the national accounts of various countries, trying to recalculate them. And we decided that we were going to recalculate the GDP of the most complicated country possible, which is India. And so we hired a team with our money from our own pockets, one in the Madras School of Economics and one in IEG in Delhi. And we basically created a system of recalculating in national accounts, which is now considered the world standard in this. And in fact, the European Union has accepted this as a standard. The UN Environment Programme has accepted this as a standard. In fact, the Supreme Court of India now uses our methodology to calculate environmental damage. It's not replaced the current GDP system. The CSO is not yet done that. But the fact is, just two guys spending their weekends, bankers, not statisticians, were able to essentially restructure the way we think about measuring human progress. And by the way, as this was going on, I was still doing a day job. I was looking at, I was covering Asian economies, looking at their economies growing, political events, monetary events, and so on. And even there, I began to see all kinds of interesting changes around me. One of the changes related to India. By about the early part of this decade, I could see that underlying India was huge changes that were going on which were not reflected in the stock market. Remember, in 2003, the Sensex was at 3,000. The Dow was then at 11 or 12,000. And I began going around all over the world, basically making the case that one day the Sensex would be at the same level as the Dow. Today, of course, the Sensex is double of the Dow, but remember, in 2003, this was thought as a completely crazy idea. Now, I'm not arguing about what will happen going forward, but certainly the point is, what seemed unreasonable at that point in time now looks pretty obvious. It was not changes that other people could not see. It was just that we had the mindset that somehow we just couldn't compete on the global stage. And because one began to question the very basis of that belief, one very quickly began to realize that, in fact, we could. Now, again, as I looked further and further into this, I began to realize there were other changes happening around me. And in this particular case, in the case of my own country, India, again, we have an inherent belief which is almost built into us, that somehow India lives in its villages. That is what Gandhiji had said about 100 years ago. And somehow this is not just a statement about the statistical truth that most Indians live in villages, but somehow the ethos of India is rural. As I traveled around India, I began to realize, however, that this was changing very, very rapidly, and that, in fact, within one generation, we will have to think of India as essentially an urban country. And that, in fact, something like 350 million Indians will move from villages into some sort of an urban space over the next 30, 40 years, which will fundamentally change the face of India in terms of our society, our economy, the ecological landscape. And yet, virtually nobody in India studies cities. It is just shocking that the most important change that we will see within our lifetimes is a phenomena that is almost not studied. So, in about 2008, I decided that, look, why argue about all this? Why not just do it? So, in 2008, I resigned from Deutsche Bank, where I was working then, and moved back to India. I set up my own small think tank called the Sustainable Planet Institute, and I began to travel all over India to document the kind of changes that are happening. I write about them in various publications. I have a regular column in Business Standard. I write about it. In fact, the last India Today also had an article about how I think about slums and so on. The point I'm trying to make here is, do not try and think that somebody else is going to get up there and begin doing it, or that something that you have thought about has already been thought about by somebody else. It probably has, but it's very likely they haven't done anything about it. So the key here is that every generation needs to rethink the whole basis on which the society in which they find themselves. They need to begin to question it. That doesn't mean that everything they find is wrong, but I think there is a case for re-looking at the whole thing over one more time. This is an unreasonable thing to do at one level, because one may ask, who am I, individual, and, so many great people have come and done this before. But in fact, it is precisely this unreasonableness that leads to progress, which is what George Bernard Shaw was talking about. So, in my lifetime, what little I have learned is that the fundamental basis of all progress is essentially to do what Nike tells you to do, which is just do it. Thank you.